Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the LENSIC and the Santa Fe Institute Public Lecture Series. This is the last of this year. The next one in the series is in February the 12th. Danielle Bassett, a physicist who has moved into questions of neurobiology, and I think will be a very fascinating, interesting talk. She's a MacArthur Fellow. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there's a few acknowledgements to make. We like to thank the very generous support of the Thornburg Investment Management Company, who have been supporting this series for a number of years. More recently, the Enterprise Holdings Foundation has been a source of our support for these evenings. And lastly, of course, thanking the LENSIC for providing us with this marvelous arena for these talks. So as I say, this is the last of this year, and we're delighted, and I personally am extremely delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, Michelle Gauvain. She has been associated with SFI for a number of years. She was a student at MIT and then went to graduate school at Cornell and worked with someone some of you may have heard of, Stephen Strogatz, a sort of applied physicist, mathematician, working on all kinds of interesting problems. And Michelle, and at that time, Stephen was associated, very much more associated with SFI than he is now. And out of that, he suggested to Michelle that she spend some time here, and she came here in roughly 2002, 2003, and finished off her graduate time here. And during that period, she hooked up with one of our young faculty members, Mark Newman, working on questions of networks. And Santa Fe Institute has been one of the major places that has developed in recent times the science, mathematics, and ideas associated with networks, both social networks and biological networks. And Michelle worked with Mark, and they wrote a couple of very influential papers, some of the most cited papers in the network arena, and to do really with trying to sort out questions of community structure and so forth related to network structures. And these have been extraordinarily influential. And Michelle, after she'd finished her degree, stayed on as a postdoc for, I think, 3 years with us. And it happened to coincide, that period happened to coincide with when I was president of the Santa Fe Institute. And we actually worked together at that time. And we wrote, I think, a delightful paper together with someone that unfortunately is not here tonight, a young student at the time, undergraduate, named Chris Kempis, who is now on our faculty. So it's a little bit incestuous, all of this. But, and I got to know Michelle very well, both in terms of a working relationship and just in terms as a colleague and someone, especially in those days, to sit around at the end of the day or at tea bullshitting about many different issues and problems. And so it's wonderful to welcome her back. She moved on from the Santa Fe Institute to take a faculty position at the University of Maryland and has really established herself as now one of the truly leading figures in the whole area of network science. However, that's not what she's going to talk about tonight, at least it may be she would touch on it. She has broadened during these last couple of years, last few years, and what you'll hear tonight is some questions that are going to be quite challenging, I think, for science and society. The use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on, in trying to understand some of the big questions that we're facing today. And as you saw in the title, harnessing the power of chaos and predicting the unpredictable with artificial intelligence, sort of a slightly Trumpian title, and predicting the unpredictable. But I'm sure we're in for a treat, and very entertaining and challenging talk. But I'm absolutely delighted to welcome her back. It's sort of, when you see your children grow up and start to become successful and find a place and they become mature, people who are making their place in society. And it's really wonderful to welcome Michelle. So with that, please welcome Michelle Gervan.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for that great introduction. I am super excited to be here. Santa Fe is my home. I mean, I only lived here for maybe 5 years, but more than any other place, this is my home. So I'm really excited to be talking about my research with you today. And so I'm going to be talking about predicting the unpredictable and artificial intelligence. So just a little bit of an overview. So we're thinking about lots of different data from different types of applications, where the main question is, how can we predict the future of some complex time series based on past history? So we just have these data streams, and we want to predict the future. We want to make sense of them. We see this kind of application in many different contexts. We're very familiar with wanting to predict the weather, to predict the stock market, to predict social media behaviors, and many more. So the approach that I'm going to talk to you about today is about combining artificial intelligence and machine learning with mathematical modeling and other tools to do even better than either one of those is going to be able to do on its own. How can we combine them in a really smart way? So you heard from Jeffrey a little bit about my career trajectory, but just to give you a sense of my perspective on some of these really challenging problems, I want to emphasize where I'm coming from. So I was trained as a physicist and applied mathematician. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, took physics as a 16-year-old in high school, introductory physics, and I just decided I'm going to be a physics professor someday. So I had no idea what that was going to be like. I only knew about, F equals ma. That was as much physics as I knew. But it was so exciting to me that, you could use mathematics to solve problems and get answers, and it could help you understand something meaningful. So that was the start for me. And then I went to MIT, where I majored in math and physics. And I really liked my math and physics courses. But there was one elective course that stood out for me. I took a course called Chaos and Complexity in the Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences department. And so you'll see that that's kind of influenced what I'm talking to you about today. So we had a few guest lectures in that by Edward Lorenz, who is known by many as the founder of chaos theory. And so to me, this was all about how you can use math and physics and apply it to all different kinds of problems, from the weather to thinking about the stock market to thinking about other complex systems. So when I went to Cornell, even though I was getting a PhD in physics, I was already not at all a traditional physicist, working with an applied mathematician on these network science problems. How could we understand the mathematics of networked systems? And that's where I became involved with the Santa Fe Institute, where I had the opportunities to collaborate with so many different people like Jeffrey, so many like-minded people, but coming to the table with different expertise, all sort of in search of how can we find the commonalities between these very disparate systems? What are the universalities that link earthquakes and stock market crashes? And how can we approach these problems with rigor? So leaving the Santa Fe Institute, to go on to a faculty job was a really hard thing for me. But I was happy to find a place at the University of Maryland in the physics department. We have a big physics department there, and which means that an oddball person like me, who's not doesn't seem like a physicist, can still fit in. And the other thing is that the University of Maryland has an excellent group in physics and math in chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics. So that was also a particularly good fit. At the University of Maryland, the mathematician Jim York, one of our distinguished university professors, actually coined the term chaos for use in mathematics. So that's my brief overview, and my disclaimer is that I'm not a computer scientist. Actually, a lot of my most famous research is computational, right? The work that Jeffrey mentioned with Mark Newman, it was about developing an algorithm for finding clusters in network data, social networks, biological networks, et cetera. But I'm not a computer scientist or an expert in a lot of the areas of machine learning. But I do think that I have something very important to bring to the table, and people from other fields, at SFI, at other places, have something to bring to the table for these important problems that we're grappling with in machine learning. So this is like my formula for success. Having this new perspective, coming as an outsider to this field of machine learning has really given me a certain kind of advantage because I'm not bogged down in the mindset that those in that field are, so I can think about the problem a little bit differently. But that's not to say that just because you don't know anything about a field means that you can make a good contribution in that area. So it's important that you combine some relevant expertise. And this is what I see happening at the Santa Fe Institute over and over again. You have people coming in with a new perspective, bringing expertise that's relevant to a certain problem, but is a little outside of the traditional realm of that problem. So the important thing to add there are these synergistic collaborations so that you have people who you collaborate with who might be more in the core of this area that you're trying to make applications to. So that's been my formula for my best research successes, and it's part of what I'm gonna talk about with you today, and it's something I've seen over and over again at the Santa Fe Institute. All right, so getting back to prediction. What kinds of systems are hard to predict? Well, certainly the weather. And we're all kind of used to watching these weather forecasts. You'll see these Doppler pictures of a hurricane, and you'll see forecasts of the hurricane's trajectory over a few days. So over the very short term, the weather forecasters know, okay, yeah, we know where the hurricane's gonna be with a fair degree of certainty in the next 12 hours, and the next day, there's a little more uncertainty, and 2 or 3 days out, we really don't know. There's this just huge area, could hit anywhere along this coast. We don't know which cities are gonna be hit, et cetera. So what is it that makes weather hard to predict? And the answer here is,
instead of touching the computer? Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry. Anyway, okay, so what makes weather hard to predict? And the answer is chaos. So what is chaos? I mean, we all use the word chaos colloquially. Sometimes we'll talk about chaotic systems and systems being hard to predict. But from a mathematical perspective, when I say something's chaotic, or when other mathematicians say this, we mean something very specific. So chaos, the features of chaos, the most important feature is this idea of sensitivity to initial conditions. You've probably heard of the butterfly effect. So colloquially, the butterfly effect is if a butterfly flaps its wings in, let's say, South Africa, then maybe that influences a hurricane happening in the Caribbean. Now, when I think about the butterfly effect, I really think about it as the difference between two nearby initial conditions. One where the butterfly doesn't flap its wings at that instant in time, and one where the butterfly does flap its wings. And this small change in initial conditions can lead to a very different weather trajectory down the line because weather is a chaotic system. And so here, this is an example, an illustration of what we call a chaotic billiard. So we have these two billiard balls in red and in yellow, and they're having some trajectories starting very close by to each other, but not at the exact same point, but both under this blue star somewhere. And I'm going to plot the trajectory of one of them in yellow and the other in red, and then I look as they bounce off this surface, the distance between the trajectories grows in time. And in fact, that distance grows exponentially. So this is the technical part that I'm going to come back to later on. So this is the technical part that I want you to get out of this talk, is this notion of a Lyapunov time. So that's the time over which this distance between these two things that started out really close together, the time over which that distance increases by a factor of E, Euler's number, which is 2.71828, et cetera. Now, in 2 Lyapunov times, that distance increases by a factor E squared. In 3 Lyapunov times, E cubed, et cetera. All right. In this system, because this difference is increasing exponentially, long-term prediction is impossible. You have to specify the initial conditions precisely if you want to predict in the long term. But in the medium term, you can hope to make some decent predictions. Also, in the medium term and in the long term, the behavior of these kinds of systems can appear random. In fact, even though the system is completely deterministic, the physics is completely known. We know how it bounces off these surfaces, where each billiard is going to go, but in the long run, it looks random. In fact, chaotic systems like this are used for random number generation, or can be used. So that's one kind of system that's hard to predict. Another kind of system that's hard to predict is one that is not deterministic, like we know all the physics, and we know if we could specify this exactly, we would know what happens next. And these other kinds of systems, the systems with randomness, are ones that we call stochastic systems. And they can also be hard to predict, often having a lot of independent actors. So for example, as in the stock market, there are trends there, definite patterns in the stock market, but prediction over the medium term, long term, virtually impossible. Other systems where this happens, you can look at the behavior of many interacting agents have these features of stochasticity. So how can machine learning help us predict the unpredictable? So there have been a variety of different methods for predicting these time series. So I'm not claiming that the work that I've been doing with my collaborators is the first in this area, but I'm going to try to highlight what our new contributions have been. But one thing is we're trying to use machine learning and couple it with some other methodologies in clever ways. So here I think is a good point to stop and talk a little bit about terminology and vocabulary. You probably see in the popular press, you might hear about artificial intelligence, the artificial intelligence behind the voice recognition in your phone. Or you might hear terms like machine learning or deep learning that has helped a machine beat a top human player at Go. So artificial intelligence is this broadest term, and this field really started in the 1950s, very ambitiously, where the goal of artificial intelligence is to have computers demonstrate sophisticated, often human-like thinking. The often human-like part is what some people might call general AI, the big dream of AI. But there's narrow AI, which is more about solving specific problems that are sophisticated and hard to do, and sometimes that humans are actually bad at. That's where machine learning comes in. So machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence, and it's all about using computers to find patterns in data, to either classify objects, as in image classification, to recognize pictures of dogs from cats, from ducks, or from kids, or to make predictions like what I'm talking about today. And in these cases, you don't explicitly program the computer to do these steps. The computer learns by being trained on a set of training data, for instance. So many ways in which machine learning is implemented is through what we call artificial neural networks. So artificial neural networks are motivated by the topology of your brain. Can we build something that processes information somewhat like the brain processes information by having certain neurons react to input, having other neurons react to that, et cetera. So that's built on a brain-like architecture, although more and more we've gotten away from really mimicking the architecture inside human brains. And that's what deep learning has done. It's taken a specific kind of artificial neural network and developed that. And it's actually not a very brain-like network. So it's a specific architecture of very large artificial neural networks that has driven a lot of recent success in image classification, voice recognition, and many more areas. So this is a little bit of a picture of the hierarchy. So artificial intelligence is this big umbrella. And machine learning is this sub-area really about kind of mining data. And deep learning is one way that's been super successful, almost surprisingly successful in this over the last several years. And I'm going to talk here today about another kind of artificial neural network architecture called reservoir computing that is particularly suited for some of these time series prediction problems and has certain advantages over deep learning. But before I get into that, I think it's important to give you a little bit of a sense of how deep learning works. And so this is the paradigm for deep learning for a problem like image classification. So in image classification, we take an image and we feed it into this network, this layered network of neuron-like units. So the information is processed through successive layers, and it's primarily a feed-forward architecture, so that the information at this layer is fed forward to the next layer, fed forward to the layer after that, and so on. But these previous layers, they don't get signals that come back from the deeper layers. And the deeper layers perform more sophisticated information processing. So in this, okay, so first we have this input image broken into pixels, and this first layer of neurons has different responses. So this neuron might fire if it indicates a blue pixel in one spot. And other neurons fire based on certain other properties of the pixels. And then this layer might detect something higher order, like edges. It fires if based on its inputs from the previous layer, those pixels combine to form an edge. And the next layer is looking at combinations of edges, maybe corners and things like that. The next layer is all about feature recognition. So here it's looking at, well, what's happening in the previous layer? Did the previous layer detect some edge combinations that maybe these are actually a nose? And then finally it gets fed into the output, and you say, okay, well, is this a dog? Does it have a nose? Does it have whiskers? Does it have other dog-like features? So in these kinds of systems, this is the basic architecture, but we have to train the values, the weights, so that for the right input, it gives us the right output. So what we do is we have a set of training data where the images have been labeled, by humans maybe, as these are a set of dog images, these are a set of cat images, and so on for the different animals. And you feed it through, and you adjust these weights so that when you feed a dog image through, it recognizes it as a dog. And then once you've trained that system, you can feed some new images to it that it's never seen before, and hopefully it will classify dogs as dogs. One thing that these kinds of systems do really well is classify things they've seen a lot of examples of before. But if they've seen a lot of horses and they've seen a lot of striped things, but they've never seen a zebra, it won't generalize very easily to say, oh, this is a striped horse. So it really needs to see a bunch of zebras to recognize something as a zebra in the canonical machine learning, deep learning architecture. So this is something that's great for classification tasks, but not as good at predicting time evolution. Because of the feed-forward architecture, the system doesn't have any memory. So it's responding to what it's getting at the input at this moment, but if you had these loops inside, these feedback loops from a deeper layer to a more shallow layer, then it could have some sort of memory and maintained response that the neurons are still responding from some signal it got a while back. So you can add feedback loops to the system to give it memory, which does make it better at predicting some of these complex time series. But this makes it a lot harder to train the weights. And the reason that happens is because the system, so in the deep learning, these are really large networks of artificial neurons. And if you want to train these weights, when you have these feedback loops, you can have a pretty good weight configuration. You make a small change, and suddenly everything gets bad. So because of the complexity of the internal dynamics, it's very hard to train the weights if you have a lot of feedback loops. So that's where this notion of reservoir computing that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today comes in. This provides a simple way to train artificial neural networks that have internal feedback. This was independently introduced by Jaeger and Maas early in the 2000s. And the main component is this very high dimensional system that's called a reservoir. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically on the next slide. But the important thing about it is we want this reservoir to give us a rich repository of dynamics. So it's capable of doing a lot of different kinds of dynamics. And then when we add the training to it, it offers us a universal dynamical system so that we can recreate almost any dynamical behavior. The really nice thing about reservoir computing is it's amenable to a lot of different simple hardware implementations, so it doesn't have the same hardware constraints that deep learning has. So a little overview, breaking down the reservoir computing from the input and output scale. So the reservoir is at the center of this. This is a recurrent artificial neural network capable of rich dynamics. So this simple reservoir we think about is a network. So this is where my network science comes into play. We have this large network of interacting units. They're neuron-like units, and these have a lot of random connections, and there's a lot of feedback loops, which means the system has memory. It's still responding at some time to something that happened much earlier on. And it has these internal firing dynamics. But we also need it to process input, like we want to put in this time series, right? So we have input fed into the reservoir through these fixed random connections. So this input time series is going to be fed into this reservoir. And what we want to do is train the reservoir to predict the next time step. So we want to take out from the reservoir the prediction for if we input some variable at time t, we want a prediction for that variable at the next time step. And you can't see this, but it says delta t over there. All right, and so what we do is we don't train the internal weights. That's what's really hard to do and sometimes impossible. Instead is we have this rich repository of dynamics and we just train the output weights. So these red connections here, these are the only things we train. So you imagine you have this rich repository of neuronal-like dynamics and you say, oh, well, I can get the right answers if I just listen to what these guys are doing a little bit and take a little bit from over here and add them together in this sensible way. But that simple training is very computationally efficient and makes it much, much faster and easier to have a recurrent neural network. So that's one of the key advantages here. And then if we want to predict not just one time step into the future, but if we want to predict, so our normal thing is we get the input, we process it, we train the weights using our training data to predict just one time step into the future. If we wanted to predict multiple time steps, we can just take the output, feed it back as input, and keep running this thing autonomously to predict multiple time steps in the future. But I've been telling you this all from the point of view of the reservoir being an artificial neural network. One of the really interesting things about this area of reservoir computing is it doesn't have to be an artificial neural network. That's one of the simplest implementations, from our side of things. But the reservoir can be a generic system capable of rich, complex dynamics. It has to have a few requirements that it meets. It has to be an input-output system. So it has to be capable of a lot of different dynamics depending on how you put different inputs into it. So it has to respond to inputs. And you have to have a way of pulling out some outputs from it. And then you can later train the weights on those outputs, just like in the artificial neural network case. So one example of this is you can use a bucket of water as a reservoir. So in this case, some researchers did this where they had a bucket of water, they had some mechanical probes that were the inputs, sort of shaking things up at various places in the water. And then they had cameras looking at ripple patterns on the surface. And this is an input-output system. You have these probes, these input device, mechanical inputs that are agitating the water. You have outputs, the camera that's looking on the surface, and you could train this to do virtually anything by just picking up training the weights between the input, training just the output weights to match whatever time series you want to predict in those cases. So this is really promising because you don't need the same kind of hardware. You don't have to have an artificial neural network. You can have other kinds of mechanical devices or other kinds of devices. So it really opens up a lot of possibilities. So let me talk to you a little bit about reservoir computing for predicting spatio-temporally chaotic systems. So I talked about what chaos is already. Spatio-temporal chaos means that we have a complex pattern that evolves in both space and time, and that the time evolution is chaotic, that the nearby initial conditions diverge from each other. So a good example of this is the weather. So for the time being, I want you to think of a spatial-temporal chaotic system. This is a model system that we've been working with as one of our test systems, as a toy system. And we actually have only one dimension of space, and then we look at time. So you can think about this as, let's say, looking at the weather. Let's measure the pressure all around the equator, right? So we only have one dimension of space, where you are around the equator. And then we're looking at how that pressure varies both in space on the vertical axis and in time. So this is a certain system, toy system called the Kuramoto-Sivashinsky system, designed to model this kind of chaotic propagation of waves. So here, okay. So you can see the features up close a little bit. It doesn't look so complex, but in fact, this is, if you look at different nearby initial conditions, they diverge quite rapidly. Okay, so how does a system like a reservoir computer do at predicting this kind of spatio-temporal chaos that's sort of motivated by the weather? Well, here in this top panel, I'm showing you the true state. So the true state is produced by a system of chaotic equations. But the reservoir computer does what we call knowledge-free prediction. It doesn't know anything about those equations. It only is given the simulated data from those equations. And it predicts the state. So this is the predicted state from the reservoir computer. Here is the difference between them, where green is good. Green means the difference is very close to 0. And so what we see here is that we obtain high-quality predictions for about 5 multiples of the Lyapunov time. So remember, Lyapunov time is the time over which something nearby distance is increased by a factor of e. So in 5 Lyapunov times, they increase by a factor of e to the 5, which is about 150. And so these trajectories are really diverging from each other, but we're still getting really good predictions, which is pretty impressive. But there are other methods for predicting chaotic systems. So I'm not claiming that this is the only one, but it definitely has some advantages. One thing I want to point out is if you look at these pictures, notice that the predicted state, this one, looks very much like the true state, even after the predictions become unreliable. So when this isn't green anymore, the predictions are no good, but it looks kind of the same. If I showed you a bunch of these pictures, you would think, oh, it's in the same class if you were doing a deep learning image classification problem. And here we say that the climate is accurately captured even after the forecast fails. So in a weather system, it's still behaving with all the physics that weather has. We've learned all that physics even if we can't forecast for longer than these 5 Lyapunov times. So the advantages that we found in this reservoir computing approach, as compared with some very useful methods for predicting chaos, some out of the Santa Fe Institute from the 1990s and so on, is that this method seems to capture the climate better than other model-free methods. Moreover, it's very simple to implement and not prone to some of the spurious results that other methods have been prone to. And further, we can scale it really well to large systems. So I've just talked about a toy model here, where this is not a system as big as predicting the weather at every grid point across the surface of the globe. So what about predicting really large systems? So if we look at the reservoir size that you need, so the size of the artificial neural network that you need in order to make good predictions as a function of the system size, that's just going to go up roughly linearly with the system size. But if we look at the training time as a function of the reservoir size, that goes up super linearly. So if I double the number of neurons I need, I'm going to more than double the amount of time that goes into training those output weights. Even though this is still a much easier training problem than the other one I mentioned, where you had to train the internal weights. So training time as a function of system size has this super linear behavior. So what do we do? Typical spatiotemporal systems like the weather are very large. I just showed you this toy system. Oh, it works really nice on this little system of equations that produces pretty pictures. How is this useful for these big problems that atmospheric scientists are grappling with? Well, the solution that we've been working on is parallel reservoir computing, just like parallel computing in general. It's a kind of extension of that. So here we have many parallel reservoirs. So each reservoir takes input from a spatially local neighborhood. So you imagine, we're predicting that pressure along the equator. We might have so the equator now is going to go this way, down this way. And so this is the input at time t. One reservoir takes in a small spatial neighborhood. Another reservoir takes in a small spatial neighborhood. But notice that the neighborhoods these reservoirs take in are overlapping. But they only predict a part of that neighborhood, the center of that neighborhood. But then when you put it back in feedback, in prediction mode, where you take the outputs and put them back into the inputs, then the multiple reservoirs talk to each other. And what we found in this kind of simple parallel architecture is that by testing with model systems, we have shown that this scheme is highly effective for very large systems. So now what we've been working on is partnering with some atmospheric scientists to use this on real weather predicting code. But now we've gotten this goal. If you let us have as many reservoirs as we want, we can have the training time now not grow with the system size. So I talked a lot about predicting chaotic systems. And the reservoir itself is capable of these chaotic dynamics. So you have this complex system, and you have these different outputs that you train the outputs to match the dynamics that you want. But what about predicting stochastic systems? Systems that have a lot of randomness. So for this, I want to talk a little bit about another very different kind of simple test case, and that's predicting user activity on Twitter. And I don't want to predict a lot of you. I'm going to ignore the text. So here's sample data for one user on Twitter. So we have the text here of the tweets. For now, we're going to ignore that. For each user, we're only going to look at the timestamps of when they tweet. And we want to do something pretty simple here, predicting by predicting the activity of a user based only on his or her past behavior. How much information is in that past behavior to predict that user's patterns? So what we do is divide the time into short intervals. And in this case, it's 10-minute intervals. So in that interval, a person either tweeted in that interval, we give them a 1, or not, a 0. And so we want to say, can we predict the user's activity? And we're making this problem kind of hard for ourselves, right? Our first approach is start by predicting the user's activity based only on his or her past activity. And so here, this is a rastogram. This is the user activity over time, and then for different days running down on the vertical axis. And what we want to do here is compare a few different kinds of data-driven approaches. The reservoir computing, which we want to understand, well, how does it work for this very different type of problem? But we can think about this reservoir computing approach as a top-down approach. The reservoir gives us a really complex system, and the outputs allow us to relax from very complicated dynamics that are contained within the reservoir until maximum predictive capability is reached. The reservoir is like this black box system, and we can get it to match and predict pretty well, but it's kind of hard to interpret what it's doing. So we can take, instead of a top-down approach, we can take what we call a bottom-up approach. We can do something that's called causal state modeling, similar to hidden Markov modeling, if that means anything to you. But if not, what that is basically for each user, we're making a different separate model for each user. For each user, we want to find the simplest model that predicts their next time step. So first, we predict their next time step based on just their average behavior overall, and then their next time step based on looking just one step in the past, 2 steps in the past, and so on, and looking at over all their history, what did they do when they had a 0, 0 at the previous 2 time steps. The nice thing about these bottom-up approaches is that they're easy to interpret. So in this case, we build models, a computational a causal state model and a reservoir computer model for each user individually. We have a training period of 45 days, a test period of 4 days where we see, well, how well are these models performing in this test period? And then we look back for these causal state models, 10 steps. We predict ahead 1 step for both the reservoir computing, the top-down model, and for the bottom-up model. And we compare it to a baseline that just says, well, if you, on average, tweeted in more than half the intervals, we'll say you tweeted every interval. If you, on average, tweeted less than half the intervals, we say you never tweeted at all. And not surprisingly, we can do better than that baseline, but actually not always. So this baseline, so the red line is the baseline approach. Some people are really hard to predict, and we're not using a lot of information to try to predict their behavior, so we've made this a challenging problem for ourselves. So this is an improvement over this baseline as a function of the tweet rate for the 2 different approaches. The blue is this bottom-up approach, and the green is the top-down reservoir computing approach. And both methods showed strong improvements in prediction for a subset of the users. But the average improvement of the two methods was about the same. So top-down and bottom-up work equally well. But that's not the end of the story for me. What was interesting was for some users, the top-down approach did a lot better, and for other users, the bottom-up approach did better. And so we took this work in a lot of different areas, working on prediction schemes that also taking account activity patterns in the user's network. We can do a lot better prediction than this just over the baseline or just looking at the user's past history. But what motivated me in this work today was this challenge. How can we combine two pretty good approaches that are clearly doing different things? And how much better could we do by combining them? So that's the question. Sometimes we want to combine two or more data-driven approaches, like the top-down approach or in the bottom-up approach that I was just talking about. But other times, we have knowledge of the dynamics. We know about the physics. So in weather forecasting models, we know a lot about the physics about how these weather variables change over time and interact with one another. So can we combine a knowledge-based model that knows about the mechanism but isn't perfect with a knowledge-free model that takes these large quantities of data and learns about the patterns in that data? So this is where we've been developing and working on this hybrid architecture. So in the hybrid architecture, we have this input time series as before, and now the input is fed into both the alternative models and into the reservoir. So I have this input time series. It goes into, let's say that this is our knowledge-based model, our model of the physics of the weather, but it's not perfect. So it goes into this. The model of the physics produces an output. That output is fed into the reservoir through the input layer, but it also goes into the output layer. So I'll say a little bit about what this means. But again, the output from the alternate model is fed both into the reservoir through the input layer and also through the output layer. And the weights in the output layer, as before, we just train the weights that come out of this. How do we weigh all the information in here? And so one simple thing you might do is you would have your knowledge-based model, your alternate model, and your reservoir, and you just take their outputs and do some kind of weighted average of them. Now, this is going to be, so we're motivated in doing something better than that, and that's why we feed the output of the alternate model into the reservoir, because that allows the reservoir to learn maybe the alternate model tends to fail if the temperature is too high, and the reservoir can then make a correction in that case, respond to what the state is, what the prediction is of the alternate model. So that this additional structure is important. And so let me just show you on, again, these toy systems of this spatiotemporal chaos, the performance of this hybrid model in a very simple test case. Okay, so again, what I'm showing you is the difference between the predicted state and the true state, but I have different ways of predicting. I have just my knowledge-based predictor, and this is what I call a low error knowledge-based predictor. So this is my good model, and it predicts for a little over 2 Lyapunov times. I see this big green region for a little over 2 Lyapunov times. And then I take a large reservoir. So remember, I could make my reservoir larger. I usually get better performance. That's going to saturate at some point. So I can only make it so large and still see improvements in performance. So I take a larger reservoir, and I also get pretty good performance here. I get predictions for these 2 Lyapunov times. But what was really impressive for us and surprising was that the combination gave us these much, much longer prediction times. So the good model plus the larger reservoir combine to give these impressive prediction times on the order of 7 Lyapunov times. Now, so if we have two good methods of predicting, right, we would expect a hybrid method to do better than the best one. You know, that's kind of the limit. We wouldn't really expect it to do the sum of the two. I mean, even to think that this would predict 4 Lyapunov times ahead of time, that wouldn't be very realistic for us. So the way I think about this is like, let me use a horse racing metaphor. So the Kentucky Derby is a 2-minute race, right? And let's say I had a couple of different horse racing analysts. And they were really pretty good that if you showed them the first minute and 40 seconds of the Kentucky Derby, they could tell you who the top 3 finishers were with pretty good reliability. Now, if you said, okay, well, you two get together and learn what you're doing, and now maybe you can make a combined approach. You wouldn't expect that in the combined approach, suddenly you could just show them a minute of the video or the first 40 seconds, and they could very predictably predict the winners in that case, the top 3 finishers. So my point here is to say that, sometimes we say at the Santa Fe Institute that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's what we're seeing here, 7 is greater than 2 plus 2. But we would never even expect to get to 2 plus 2 here. We wouldn't even expect to get to 4 Lyapunov times. We'd just expect to get a little bit better than the better one. Or at least that's kind of what we were thinking. So this is one of those surprising results. And what's even more surprising is that we can really degrade the quality of both our model. So this model has a very short prediction time, less than 1 Lyapunov time, or we could have a very small reservoir, and we might want to do that for different, for computational efficiency. So we might not have the computing power to do these larger reservoirs. So you combine those two things together, and you still get really pretty good predictions over fairly long intervals. So that was surprising. And some of this we have explanations for, but not all of it. But I think it leads to a lot of new and exciting open research directions. So the question here for me is, can we use this kind of hybrid scheme that we developed that basically lets the machine learn how to combine the two different prediction methods sensibly? Can we use this to combine a large number, many different machine learning approaches or different knowledge-based models? So this reminds me, when I started thinking about this, well, this reminds me of this wisdom of crowds notion, which is an active area in some human dynamics research. So this is the notion that large groups of individuals make high-quality collective judgments. And it was the topic of a popular book by James Surowiecki. I think this came out in 2004. And so, one simple example of this is, let's say you're at a fair, there's a big jar of jelly beans. You ask an individual to guess the number of jelly beans in that jar. Chances are they're not going to be that close. And you could even ask some of the individuals who have a pretty good record at getting the right number in the past. So you're going to take the best guessers from your history of having this fair over several years. And you ask them for their guesses, and they're maybe a little closer than the average person, but they're still not that good. But if you instead take a big group of people, poll them, take the average of their guesses, you get something really close to the truth. And so that's this notion of the wisdom of crowds. But there's some weaknesses in the wisdom of crowds that in many cases, having this crowd wisdom requires individuals to reach decisions independently. So when individuals follow one another, when they see what others are doing and they make their judgments on that, you get less sound judgments than if they act independently. And so this is thought to drive processes we see like stock market bubbles and things like that. So that would be something that presumably machines wouldn't be vulnerable to. So that's one benefit if we were thinking about how to combine many machine learning approaches. So how can we think of this notion of many and apply it to ensembles of machines, where we could think about, okay, well, we know about the wisdom of individual machines. How can we think about the wisdom of artificial crowds? And some of the next steps that we can think about here are not just artificial crowds where everything's a machine. We can combine machines, as I said before, with some of these mathematical models to give us these important improvements. But we can also have machine-human ensembles, right? So a lot of times in weather forecasting, for example, these machines make predictions, but at various layers, you have humans overseeing the processes and identifying, oh, there's something wrong with this forecast. Something has gone off here, and you need these kinds of interventions. So I can imagine, populations of machines and humans. And so you think, okay, well, the machine might not be vulnerable to these follower-type dynamics that can weaken the wisdom of crowds, but they have a lot of other vulnerabilities. One of the largest of which is that we, as humans who are using their outputs, we don't understand how they got these good answers. It's like we see that the machines are really good at classification in deep learning because we've learned all those weights. But even though after we go back and we learn those weights for the different layers, if we look at those weights, we still can't interpret, like, why does it make sense that those weights give us a good solution? So these are a lot of different open questions in this. What about these human-machine interactions? And what about the weaknesses that machines have? We know about some of the weaknesses that humans have. So just some conclusions here. So I've talked to you today about reservoir computing and how it provides a promising method for predicting complex time series. So why is it promising? Because the reservoir gives us this rich repository of complex dynamics that we can then harness. That's the harnessing chaos part of my title, that we have this complex system that by just drawing from it in a sensible way, tuning these output weights, we can harness that chaos to make predictions to give us important insights. And I talked to you a little bit about, well, how we can take this reservoir computer scheme and do a parallelization of it that will allow us to tackle very large problems, like not just toy models of the weather, but real models of the weather. The part that I'm most excited about is this hybrid scheme that really worked better than we expected, and we don't understand exactly why that's true. And so there are a lot of open questions there. So the hybrid scheme that couples this alternate forecasting approach, like a knowledge-based model, with the reservoir, we see in these test cases that it offers further dramatic improvements. But the exciting part for that to me is that the hybrid method can offer a step towards what we call explainable machine learning. So like I said, in deep learning, we train these output weights, and then the deep learning system is a great image classifier, or it's great at voice recognition. But when we look and try to analyze this system, we don't understand why it's so good at voice recognition. To me, the hybrid scheme, by combining different types of machine learning methods with knowledge-based models, it allows us a method for hypothesis testing in machine learning, asking questions like, what are the weaknesses of the reservoir? And how can we find that? Well, we can find it by coupling it with different models. So we can see that, okay, well, maybe when the reservoir is coupled with a certain other kind of alternate model, that's really filling in certain gaps, and the coupled performance is much better. It highlights a weakness in the machine learning that we can then go on and create better machine learning approaches. But similarly, the machine learning, the reservoir can tell us about the weaknesses in our knowledge-based model. So we have a physics model of the weather, but we can look through and do a post-analysis of how our hybrid system is performing and look and see, okay, well, actually, our knowledge-based model is failing in these certain areas, and that's where our machine learning reservoir scheme is having to compensate it. And it gives us a guided way of going back and finding out what the physics that we missed is. So, and then finally, scaling this up to populations and crowds of machines is a new and exciting area to think about ensembles and layers of coupled machines. So finally, I want to say that I talked to you about a few different research projects here, and really involved a lot of those synergistic collaborations that I mentioned earlier. A lot of very talented graduate students, mostly from physics, who have been really excited about applying methods from physics to machine learning. I should say a lot of this has been part of a research grant from DARPA, from the Department of Defense, what they call the physics of artificial intelligence. So they're interested in, well, how can we not just have a black box of artificial intelligence, but couple physics knowledge-based models into these systems. And also collaborations with several faculty members, both at the University of Maryland and elsewhere, with a diversity of expertise in mathematics, computer science, physics, atmospheric science, and in business. So with that, I'll end, and thank you very much for your time.
Also, if anyone from upstairs wants to ask a question, we just ask that you come downstairs to do so. Okay, Michelle, I have one over here.
How will quantum computing affect all this? And why are humans so interested in predicting the future?
Because you can make money. Lots of reasons. Don't you want to know if it's going to snow next week? Okay, so how will quantum computing affect all this? I haven't thought a lot about that. I mean, quantum computing, okay, so my first answer to that is quantum computing offers a whole nother paradigm of computing. Quantum computers can solve different kinds of problems better than classical computers, but for some problems, classical computers are still going to be very good. And so it's possible that what we learn in these hybrid approaches can help us couple quantum computers with classical computers. So that's an exciting area. And as far as why do we care about prediction, I mean, there's lots of reasons why we care about prediction, but I think predicting the weather is a hard problem, intellectually stimulating, but also there are a lot of people who just, want to predict elections, want to predict the stock market.
First of all, just thanks for coming down, and that was a really great, presentation. So you mentioned the input layer can be kind of improved with knowledge we have through physics models. Mm-hmm. What about the notion of for maybe filtering for noise at the input layer?
That is an excellent question. And that's actually where I think about the alternate model coming in. So these alternate models, Yes, okay. So this box, I have this input data, and I could feed it through lots of different things. One thing is filters. And so it turns out that if you feed a chaotic signal plus noise into the reservoir itself is a really good noise filter. And it will, if you train it to just predict the chaotic signal without the noise, you do pretty well. But there are other methods of noise filtering, and that's something that we're thinking about. And that's one of those ways where you could use these different building blocks and sort of test what are the weaknesses in this black box that we don't totally understand. Couple it with different filters and say, well, we can look at these output weights, and the output weight might not say that, well, the filtering didn't really matter. I'm just listening to what's happening in the reservoir. So we can learn about how much the filters would help in those cases. It's a great question.
What about the alternate to filters, anti-filters, where you actually introduce noise to move the solution space from one area to another novel area?
Yes, that's a good question. That's also part of this. It's not something that I've explored a lot. You know, so we've used these systems on both stochastic and deterministic processes. And I've talked about the reservoir. I didn't mention its internal dynamics, but you have a separate lever that you can turn that adds noise between these neuron-like units. And so the hypothesis might be that you might need a little bit of that noise to more faithfully reproduce stochastic time series as compared to deterministic ones. That's a good question about having the noise inside as a positive thing.
Hi, thank you for an excellent presentation. In terms of application to other systems, as a doctor, I'm curious about healthcare applications. Individual patients are now complex systems in and of themselves. Genomic data, laboratory data, radiologic data. As a doctor, how do we begin to incorporate the gamut of this? And are there applications for individual patients?
So the answer to that is yes. I have one collaboration with Bill Rand of the Business School at NC State. He and I did this work together on the Twitter data. And we're looking at some clinical time series data for patients in shock. But it's measuring different physical clinical variables as a function of time and looking at, well, can these machine learning algorithms detect these anomalies that physicians wouldn't recognize? Another example with this, I've talked to some collaborators about applying this to brain dynamics, looking at seizure patterns, and also other like traumatic brain injury type things, looking at, well, that's sort of a classification problem, but can you see that the dynamics in individuals with traumatic brain injury are different? How so? And so on. So these things can be used for that. We haven't been doing it yet, except for the case in shock, where we're hoping to do a little bit more.
Hi, I had a couple questions actually. One is about the reservoir, and I just thought I'd throw out something crazy. And then secondly about the parallel computing and the relationship between the two. And so I have some expertise in agent-based modeling, and I'm wondering if a neural network really is the right place to start with the reservoir, and maybe it's actually clusters of things that have their own characteristics and attributes and sets of interactions. And then secondly, I was wondering, are there limits to the parallel computing that the reservoirs use? In other words, is there a hard limit that you might butt up against?
These are good questions about the parallel computing and some of the intersections with agent-based modeling. So the parallel computing works really well when, on something like weather, where there are spatial neighborhoods, right? So there's spatially localized regions, and we can count that. We can do these. We can tile up space into these and have these overlapping regions. Now, if you're trying to predict something like agents or human interactions where the connection patterns of what's local is changing a lot in time, you might want to do something a little bit different. And actually, part of our funding from DARPA is in this direction. How do you predict agents? That's not exactly what your question was in terms of the neural network, but I'm going to go in a little different direction. And so you can imagine you can parallelize things in that case where, let's say, you want to predict let's say, Twitter patterns of Twitter activity patterns, but they're following different people, other people as a function of time, and you want to take that into account. So now, instead of having these fixed local neighborhoods, you have these time-evolving local neighborhoods. So the parallelization has to change about which units pass information back and forth, but we can still try to break up that problem and make it modular in that way. And we can use some of this like community finding, cluster detection, and network stuff that I've worked on recently. So that's some of the intersection between network science, machine learning, and parallelization that I've been thinking about.
So to generalize from this, it seems like one of the things that you're kind of pointing toward is that the more types of cognition you leverage on a problem, the more likely you are to understand it. And I'm curious because we know that the best performing chess teams in the world are combinations of groups of human beings and machines. And then the individual human brain also has like the left and right hemispheres work very differently. So I'm curious if you see forward with this, like how do you imagine this being extrapolated into a sort of more general understanding of knowledge and forecasting and strategies for that as like multiple methodological strategies?
So that's a big question, and that's hard to give a really good answer to. But I could see it being used for putting teams together, right? Where whether it's teams of machines or humans and machines, you realize that certain different types of specialization are useful for these problems, and how do we optimally combine them? And like in these teams for chess, you just don't get as many people together as possible. You want to do it in a smart way, and you have constraints. You might only, be able to have so much computing time, so many humans available to you. So how can you construct those teams that give you this excellent performance? That's a great question.
Right here.
So first of all, it was a great talk. Second of all, it sort of feels like blasphemy. As someone that works in like chaotic time series, we know that there's fundamental bounds on predictability governed by the Lyapunov spectra. And for example, Pessin's identity gives formal relations between prediction time, and you seem to be just breaking that.
No, not breaking it. Just doing better than other methods are doing. We're not breaking it. Yes, so the reason I call it unpredictable, so this is a great question. Like when you think about chaos in the long term is unpredictable, and some of these prediction times are just crazy. But they're just crazy because a lot of the methods that we're used to aren't quite as good. And so eventually it's going to break down. I can't predict for 100 Lyapunov times. There is the specificity of my initial conditions is going to kill me. It's going to get me sometime. But I do have to say, that being said, it's not breaking these boundaries, but it's getting a lot closer to them than I expected. And I'll just say this to you as a chaos theorist. The real surprising thing is in the climate, how well we can predict the climate. So we can predict how, so in chaos, right, we have this exponential divergence. So some dimensions stretch exponentially apart. And so the positive Lyapunov exponents are dimensions that stretch exponentially, but we also have contracting negative exponents because there are other dimensions that other directions along which things get closer together. So it's not hard to predict the positive Lyapunov exponents, but we can even predict the negative ones, which is sort of not seen in other chaos prediction schemes. And that's part of why I say we get the climate right. That's a little technical diversion, but I thought you might be interested.
One over here.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a complete novice with all this, but is something like the climate really chaotic, or is it just that our background and our knowledge base is so limited that we don't see all of the steps into the future? And if at that point when we are able to measure all those tiny little things that affect, it won't be chaotic at all?
So I'll answer that as best as I can. So something like the weather really is chaotic in the sense that in order to, that if we don't get our initial conditions very precise, our forecasts fall apart, and the distance between our trajectories, our forecasts for close initial conditions, diverges exponentially in time. So that's our definition of chaos, right? So we can do better and better if we could define our initial conditions more precisely, but at some level that's impossible. But in terms of the climate, there are certain features in the climate. So it depends on what you want to predict about the weather or the climate. So hurricane patterns are notoriously chaotic, but there are other time series patterns that are not so chaotic, that have a lot of regularity to them, like trends in, the diurnal day-night variation in temperature goes up and down in a certain regular way. So there are certain statistical, or what we might call coarse-grained features, where there is regularity and not chaos, and it just depends on what variables are we trying to predict.
Okay, one last question.
I was curious to what extent the neurophysiology of the brain would not be a very good model for you, in the sense that the brain, let's say in an individual, a healthy individual, put it this way, we strive for homeostasis. And if you're predicting climate change or whatever, adverse events, it is an imbalance of the homeostasis of nature, put it this way simplistically. So how does the brain in a healthy individual maintain homeostasis through your filters, regardless of what the external input is? That somehow the brain manages to maintain the balance, the homeostasis. Can you learn more in the, let's say, physics or electronic or whatever you want to call it, signals, to help you understand why some areas of your climate, hurricane explodes versus contraction from another site?
So I'm not sure if I've interpreted your question correctly, but one point that you're making is about the homeostasis in the brain, that we want to be able to respond reliably over and over again. And is the learning that the brain does the exact kind of learning that we want these systems to do? And in some cases, that's what deep learning has taught us. I mean, when we talked about artificial intelligence, we thought about human-like learning, right? But our biggest successes in artificial intelligence are not things that humans can necessarily do quite as well. Sometimes they're things that humans can't do very well at all in some of this pattern recognition. Obviously humans are good at recognizing dogs from cats in pictures, but there are other areas in machine learning where the machines are better. Like, so for instance, this is a big effort in the medical field at analyzing radiographs, right? And so, or other types of bioassays. Sometimes the machine learning mechanisms do better than humans. So do we really want to mimic the architecture of the brain? And in general, we don't necessarily have to do that, but in this case, there was one thing that we did want to mimic, was having these internal loops. And that loops provide us the ability for the system to have memory, such that their response at a certain time step is dependent on what kind of input that came many time steps before.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thanks.